Okay.
And we are live. Yeah. So welcome everyone to the final ENSO seminar of 2018, our December ENSO seminar, which will be presented by Dr. Glenda Satne of the University of Wollongong. So as is customary at this stage of the process, I'm going to sort of relax and take a little bit of time as we get started, so to allow some viewers to log on and potentially for others to join us live, just to let others get up to speed with the live stream. So we've sort of one or two viewers logging in and getting us started. So as we do so, I'll just give you a little bit of information about Glenda. So based, I think, primarily in Wollongong, and certainly from full-time from January. Glenda's a philosopher specializing in philosophy of mind and social ontology, and also the philosophy of language. And her work has sort of covers a number of areas, but has a sort of specific interest in evolution of human-specific cognitive capacities. Within sort of naturalistic frameworks, and then more recently within the radical enactive cognition, or at least engaged with the radicals, as it were, in the sort of the past work. And it's my understanding that this evening's seminar, or I say this evening, from my point of view, good afternoon and or good morning, depending on where it is you happen to be at the moment. I think it's afternoon for you, Glenda. So the seminar today will be examining some of the challenges to radical enactivism that arise when examining how the evolution of these specifically human capacities occurs over time. So so we have a few viewers on board at this point, and we have the live stream up and ready to run. We may have live members join us at some point during the seminar, but they'll come in quietly, and I'm sure they'll be polite. So I will invite you now, Glenda, to kick us off and present to us the December ENSO seminar for 2018, Naturally Evolving Minds.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me, both Mark and Matthew. I'm very happy to be presenting my work here. I also want to thank everybody that is joining us today from different parts of the world. And without further ado, let me start with my talk today. So, the topic of my talk today is naturally evolving minds, continuity and transformation. And what I want to do is to discuss the framework in which we discuss the evolution of human cognitive capacities and the nature of such capacities. And one natural point of departure for such question is to wonder about human uniqueness. So are humans cognitively unique? And Darwin famously claimed in The Descent of Man that there is no fundamental difference between man and the higher mammals in their mental faculties, that all the differences are differences of degree and not of kind. Now, Crane has argued that despite the widespread acceptance of naturalism in many of the human sciences, discussions of the extent to which human beings are unique are still common among philosophers and scientists. And here are some examples. For example, a recent paper by Andrea Kern and Kern Moll in philosophical psychology that challenges this idea. Also, Baron has discussed this under the heading of continuity skepticism. And as we will see, Penn, Holoyak, and Povinelli have also disputed Darwin's claim somehow. So, as Crane argues, Darwin's claim is often taken as a simple consequence of the theory of evolution by natural selection. And Darwin's opinion has been so closely linked with evolutionary theory that it has been virtually impossible to contest his opinion while supporting such theory, while supporting evolutionary theory. But of course, whether human cognition is different in kind or degree depends on what fundamental, degree, and kind mean if fundamental difference is just an important difference or a significant difference or a scientifically or philosophically interesting difference, then, as Crane concludes, Darwin's claim is surely not true. Now, discussions about human uniqueness have revolved around the fact that humans have the capacity for language, or a closely related capacity. One might think that this capacity, the capacity for representing states of affairs, is part of the capacities that linguistic creatures have, or the core capacity that language provides, or the key precondition for capacity for language. And this capacity is the capacity for representing states of affairs as true or false, being true or false with respect to what they are about. So correct or incorrect with respect to their contents. And the thought is that this capacity for representation of things as being in ways, and then things making these contents true or false, impact many of the things humans do. And Penn, Holojak, and Povinelli have claimed the following, that human animals and no others build fires and wheels, diagnose each other's illnesses, communicate using symbols, navigate with maps, risk their lives for ideals, collaborate with each other, explain the world in terms of hypothetical causes, punish strangers for breaking rules, imagine impossible scenarios, and teach each other how to do all of the above. And so you might think that some of the items in this list are provide the capacities for them are already available for other creatures, some other mammals, maybe even some other animals. But some of the items of the list are surely things that only humans do. And the thought is that there are special capacities, maybe the capacity for language understood as the capacity for representing states of affairs as true or false is such capacity. Now, there are three key questions that revolve around these representational capacities. As I said, I think it's thought as being at least one capacity that is allowed, or even the condition for linguistic capacities in general, depending on who is making this argument. And the questions are as follows. So the first one asks whether the representational capacities are humanly unique or not. It asks whether the capacity to think about the world in ways that are true, correct, with respect to it, are human-specific, or whether humans share this capacity with other animals. This is what I call the human uniqueness question. A second question asks whether this capacity, the very same capacity of representation, develops phylogenetically and ontogenetically out of more primitive forms of intentionality, or whether we are dealing with the capacity for which no evolutionary or developmental account can be given. This is the evolutionary and developmental continuity, discontinuity question. And the thought here is that this capacity might not allow us to have a story in terms of little steps that we can tell about its emergence. And this is the negative conclusion, while the positive is, yes, we can give such an account. The third question is whether the acquiring or immersion of full-fledged representational capacities in the sense defined wholly transform the cognitive repertoire of the organisms that acquire this capacity, or whether the process of acquiring or the process in which they emerge consists in turning previous already existing capacities into more complex or sophisticated capacities. And this is the transformative, non-transformative question. Now, different brands of naturalism have defended different views which say yes or no to the different questions we have raised. So, for example, anti-naturalist or liberal naturalists, so the kind of naturalists that in general reject the possibility of reducing semantic and intentional items to the kind of phenomena that you find in the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, and biology, and either propose to extend the sciences that we need to take in considerations and the facts and objects that we need to take in consideration, or directly deny the possibility of naturalizing such capacities. Such positions say yes to the uniqueness question, so the representational capacities are humanly unique, but they say no to the continuity question. We cannot give a story that describes the emergence of these capacities in continuous stage unfolding. And these, for example, are the positions of people like philosophers like McDowell, Davidson, and Kern and Moll more recently. Now, strict naturalists, so the ones that do restrict the tools for accounting for different phenomena to the tools offered by the strict sciences or the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, and biology, have defended that we should say no to the uniqueness question, much in the line that we saw in Darwin, and yes to the continuity question. Relevantly, a number of non-reductive naturalist positions, for example, autopoietic enactivism, also says no to the uniqueness question, understood in the strong sense of saying that there's something quite specific, unique, and not just the more complex version of previous capacities in the human case, but they say yes to the continuity question. Then other forms of non-reductive naturalism, such as relaxed naturalism, a brand of naturalism that I have developed and endorsed, and that the radical enactivists endorse, this kind says yes to the uniqueness question and yes to the continuity question. And finally, some forms of creationism or panpsychism say no to the uniqueness question and no to the continuity question, basically because they think that we have different principles or properties in nature that explain different properties and objects, and that we cannot explain the emergence of properties for intentionality in terms of properties that are not intentional. All right. Now, I'm interested here in defending the third position from a number of attacks. And these attacks have basically been on all three issues, I presented at the beginning. So the natural origins of content program that the radical enactivist defends has been criticized for not possibly accounting for the continuous emergence of development, the evolutionary trajectory from basic forms of non-representational cognition to contentful, full-fledged representational capacities. It has also been criticized for making it the case that contentful minds are wholly transformed, leaving no room for basic cognition in such minds, against the radical enactivist claim to the contrary. And finally, it has also been criticized for not possibly substantiating the claim that human representational capacities are unique. So what I want to do is to argue that these three, uniqueness, transformation, and continuity, are different questions that we need to carefully separate and carefully consider, and that skepticism about continuity and the non-uniqueness claim, so both are problematic, and they furthermore spring from a common assumption about the nature of cognition. This is the assumption that I call the uniformity assumption, to assume that all cognition is at the core of the same kind. And the upshot of this is to to argue for the idea that actually the criticisms against radical enactivism, and it's particularly to the project of giving the story about the natural origins of content, miss their target, and that contrary to those criticisms, actually pursuing the central hypothesis of Reck and Nock might help us steer clear from philosophical problematic assumptions and actually closer to the facts that we can very, in a way that is very productive, investigate empirically, and that will put us in the right track of thinking about the cognitive capacities that are at issue. So I will briefly address the framework of Reck and Nock. I think most of you know the basics. I will run through them just to refresh your minds about them. And then I will address the problem of continuity and show how these different issues of transformation and uniqueness are connected to it. I will go beyond uniformity, and I will go back to the challenges and briefly explain how we address those issues from this kind of perspective. So the framework. The basic idea that Rec defends is that there's no prospect for naturalism, and in particular for naturalizing intentionality, if we assume that intentionality has to be equated, is the same as having semantic content. Thus, that the assumption that intentionality is all of one piece, that it's all intentionality is to have or to entertain representational contents, so the kind of thing we were discussing under the heading of representational capacities, that assumption must be abandoned, and instead we need to distinguish different forms of intentionality. And Rec proposes to distinguish at least two forms. I think there might be more. We can discuss that in the Q&A. But we have, on the one hand, primitive contentless intentionality, what the view calls UA intentionality. And on the other hand, we have content-based intentionality, which is the kind I described as the one that involves representational contents. So according to Rec, all intentionality is a form of active, informationally driven, wordly directed engagement of a creature. And this form of cognition, it's a form of cognition that depends on the tendencies for active engagement of these creatures that are shaped by their ontogenetic and phylogenetic history. So our intentionality is a matter of selectively and sensitively responding to the world and to each other, and it does not involve the formation of representational content. It's in this sense that the view says that basic minds, which are minds that do not contentfully represent objects, have the capacity of representing the world and entertaining contents that are true or false, correct, incorrect in that sense with respect to what they represent, that those kinds of minds target objects without representing them. And these are forms of intentional directedness of the whole organism towards the world, towards other creatures, which are not semantic nor representational. They are adaptive, normative, informational, rich, and importantly, they are complex. So even if we distinguish between basic and non-basic, that doesn't mean that our intentionality is not complex. It just means that we have levels, and there is a level where we have minds which are not representational and a higher level of cognitive complexity and richness, which we call representational. And this is the second claim. So the second claim is that we must recognize the contentful character of some thought and language, and that this is required to explain prominent features of some cognitive activities. For example, the kind of cognitive activities that Penn, Holojak, and Povinelli described. So some thoughts and linguistic utterances are contentful in the full-blooded sense of exhibiting familiar properties, such as reference and truth, the kind of correctness I described before. And three, the view holds that it is possible in principle to explain the origins of content-involving cognition in a scientifically respectable, gapless way. How is this so? Well, and this is specifically the Natural Origins of Content project. This project seeks to explain how contentful states of mind develop through processes of engaging in established sociocultural practices. So the story is a sociocultural story. And it endorses Haugeland's point that contentful tokens, like ritual objects, customary performances, and tools, occupy determinate niches within a social fabric, and these niches define them as what they are, and that only in virtue of such culturally instituted roles can tokens have contents at all. So the NOC program follows Haugland in proposing that a mechanism, and actually a set of mechanisms of conformity to social norms, lies at the heart of the cultural scaffolded process that enables content to emerge. Importantly, there are going to be a set of different forms of social activity which are cultural, which culturally institute roles or actions and tokens, which would not endow them with content. But there are some that do. So which ones? When do contentful representations emerge? This is when, in a very special form of game, a social game, sociocultural game. This is when something plays a role that is answerable to the kind of in-game externality, to put it in the words of Price, that is provided by a special game, the game of claim making, right, in which players bind themselves through those norms and through the tokens they use to standards that are beyond themselves. So to things, actually, that count as criteria of assessment of the claims they are making, of the moves they are making, of the tokens they are using. This is a very special sort of practice. This is a practice that opens the possibility of going wrong and getting things right in ways that are not purely biological and in ways that do not reduce to pure communal agreement or conformity. So there might be other ways in which we can discuss whether something is appropriate or inappropriate, good or wrong, but this is a special kind of way, which is related precisely with the notion of representation and truth and reference. So according to the REC view and the NOC program, is this unique sort of sensitivity to very particular kinds of norms that is needed and is a necessary requirement for the existence of contentful ways of thinking and talking. And what this program does is to endorse a view that we call relaxed naturalism, which is a non-strict, non-reductive kind of naturalism that denies the possibility of reducing intentionality to some other item to be found in the toolbox of the hard scientist, and instead claims that all we need to naturalize intentionality is to be able to make sense of its emergence and acquisition. So to tell a story about the natural origins or the natural history and the developmental trajectory of such practices and of agents engaging in such practices and developing the capacities for contentful thinking and talking. Furthermore, relaxed naturalisms do not restrict the tools by which those illuminating explanatory connections force methodological pluralism, because it allows that not only the hard sciences, but also social and human sciences, such as developmental psychology, comparative psychology, evolutionary anthropology, and so on and so forth, will have a role to play in telling this story, right? And this is essential, as we will see. Now, despite this, the detail of the proposal, many think that this program is doomed to fail. Why is this so? Well, they claim that there is a fundamental continuity problem. So Richard Menary says radicals have a problem bridging the gap between basic cognitive processes and enculturated ones, since they think that meaning or content can only be present in a cognitive system when language and cultural scaffolding is present. But that, of course, does not sit well with evolutionary continuity. And Clowes and Mendonça have argued that this is so because REC claims that basic minds should not be characterized as representational, but that language users take on some of the representational capacities they have of the language they use. And they say that this is a saltationist view, and it's saltationist because representation is only added on as a consequence of using language or narrative or possibly some other social resources. But then they think REC introduces a chasm between representationally enhanced minds and more basic minds. And then once such chasm is introduced, we can rule out any possibility of providing a naturalistic explanation of the origins of content in terms of gradual, continuous change of the sort of that evolutionary explanations of the kind we started with, the Darwin kind, favor. Furthermore, the idea is that in drawing this distinction between basic, non-contentful, non-basic, and non-basic contentful cognition, REC introduces a deep discontinuity in nature, one that is even at odds with relaxed naturalism of the sort that NOC favors. And the claim is that by emphasizing this uniqueness of human representational capacities, REC commits to continuity skepticism. And then this leaves no room for the NOC program to progress. Now, this worry, the worry that of whether we can account for evolutionary continuity, has been used dialectically to supply reason and further reason for embracing a thoroughgoing representational theory of mind, one that assumes that cognition always involves content. This is to assume what I call the uniformity principle. That is the idea that all cognition is at the core of the same kind. And the idea is that this offers protections against this problem of evolutionary discontinuity. So there are a number of examples in the literature. Tomasello is a very good example. He claims that humans are unique, say, in a degree sense, because they are able to have communicative intentions or objective representations. But these are further complications or complexizations of more basic intentions or more basic representations. And the same claim is made by telesemanticists such as Millikan or Sternly. And so we get a picture in which what we have is a difference in degree and not in kind, further complexization. Furthermore, autopoietic enactivism also endorses this assumption that all cognition is at the core of the same kind without endorsing the representational theory of mind. They claim that cognition is sense-making all the way up and all the way down, that cognitive interactions include, for example, a bacterium's ability to sense the concentrations of sucrose in its immediate environment and to move itself accordingly, and that mind reaches down to the simple organisms. Life is always minded, and the richer the living form, the richer its mind. So, as in the case of the representational theory of mind, denying a strong human uniqueness thesis and endorsing the uniformity assumption that all cognition is at the core of the same kind is sought to put one on the right track to account for evolutionary continuity. And the idea is that that move, this endorsing of psychological continuity, allows one to tell an homogeneous tale about the evolution of cognition, one that in terms of core background, does not need a sophistication of an elaborate discourse, and one that can see highly evolved languages and measuring devices as only very specialized but and largely arbitrary realization of much simple or more universal functional principles and measurements by which they think we can define every language and every measurement. But the question I want to raise is, are really these content involving cognition theories or autopoietic enactivism stories about psychological continuity the best way to account for the distinctive properties of human cognition? We started with Penn and Holojak's and Povinelli's claim that human animals and no others do many things. And they say, and I think they are right in saying, that the most, if not one, but the most important challenges maybe for telling a plausible biological story about evolution is to explain the manifest functional discontinuity between human capacities or human minds and non-human minds. So this is a challenge we cannot skew. And so they emphasize that the profound biological continuity between humans and non-human animals masks an equally profound discontinuity between such minds. And Baron has claimed, for example, that as in the same line I'm arguing here, that the conviction that there must be some diachronic emergent story actually encourages proponents of continuity to overinterpret the mentality and communicative behaviors of existing animal species and to underplay some of the evidently unique features of human thought and language. So can we go beyond uniformity, and how? So the first question is whether a gapless account of evolutionary continuity, one of our constraints, right, is possible without assuming psychological continuity, which will allow us to make justice for the differences between human cognition and other animals' cognition. So the question is whether evolutionary continuity does entail psychological continuity. And Baron, for example, clearly distinguishes between diachronic continuity, which is the word she has for our continuity question, from what she calls synchronic continuity, which refers to similarity and difference between the cognitive capacities of humans and other animals, which is what I call the uniqueness question. And she says the synchronic version of the deep chasm clearly does not imply the diachronic claim, which is much more radical. So the idea here is that even if you allow that there are dissimilarities in the synchronic level, so when you compare, that does not mean that there is no diachronic continuity or continuous story one can tell. And this is because evolutionary continuity is obviously compatible with psychological discontinuity, even with a thoroughly gradualistic evolutionary view, Baron says. And she exemplifies this with the case of the transition from flightless reptiles to birds, which culminated in a sharp physiological and functional discontinuity between bird flight and reptile locomotion, but that we can think actually evolved through a multidimensional continuum and can still be distributing along that continuum. So the presence of gaps, even if wide, is consistent with the existence of extinct intermediaries. So, if synchronic discontinuity is compatible with diachronic continuity, why Reknock seems to be a non-starter for telling an evolutionary continuous story? Well, because the assumption that all cognition is uniform, that it's all at the core of the same kind, that only varies in degrees of complexity, while it's not supported by evolutionary biology, drives arguments both in favor of skepticism about human uniqueness, so the full continuity thesis, and also skepticism about evolutionary continuity. And this, I think, has the form of a dilemma between two positions that both commit to the uniformity thesis. On the one hand, some that commit to the uniformity thesis and want to give a naturalistic answer to the evolutionary question about continuity, deny uniqueness. So they think that even minimal forms of cognitions have to have the same sort of properties that very sophisticated forms of cognition have. And this is photopoietic enactivism and semantics. At the other extreme, some endorsing again a uniformity thesis about cognition defend uniqueness. So I think this is the only, there's only one form that cognition has, but then they deny that there are any other forms, and because of this, they are devoid from an evolutionary account of how these human capacities evolve. This is the case of McDowell and Davidson. But Reck and Knock deny the uniformity thesis, and in this way, they make room for both human uniqueness and evolutionary and developmental continuity about human cognitive capacities. And I think in this way, they stay closer to evidence regarding similarities and difference between humans and non-human forms of cognition. So, can we really accept that psychologically there is a difference in kind and still account for phylogenetic and ontogenetic lineages of these capacities? I think yes, as long as we do not confuse accounting for the evolution of cognitive capacities with giving a uniform account of mindedness and cognition, which is a different project. And that leads to a degree story with no difference in kind, but it's not compulsory. So avoiding the identification, I think, and then I go to a few slides on the how to address the challenges and the final part of the talk. I think we can address the three challenges that Reck has, that had been raised against Reck. So briefly to the challenges. So first, how does Reck-Knock address the continuity challenge? Reck-Knock will give you what we call a kinky diachronic explanation. Why is it kinky? Because it does not play along a linear dimension. It's a tale about a lot of different elements, a lot of different platforms. So a multi-story, multidimensional story that involves crucially appeal to sociocultural platforms and constructions. And very briefly, so social cooperation can be thought to be the key driving force of the evolutionary process, and different forms of collective intentionality and social cooperation underwrite different stages in the hominid's evolution. So the key idea is that different forms of collective intentionality, coordination, and social conformism associated with different social norms allow special forms of cooperative collective action and interaction that were beneficial for the fitness of each hominid species, and that provided the context for special social norms, among which we have as a special case norms of claim making to emerge. So the idea is that these forms of collective intentionality that emerge from interactions between agents gave rise to complex forms of collective intentionality that in the turn feedback loop into the psychological capacities of those agents, giving rise to further and further more complex form of and structures of action and activity. So structures of authority, for example, that distinguish between subordinate and dominant, and relatively established roles in cooperation, for example, in the case of chimps and bonobos, and more flexible norms associated with language, with arithmetics, with norms of reciprocation in the case of the hominins, that allow for more abstract and universal and objective capacities that in its turn also transform collective intentionality. And this involves a crucial appeal to elements in the environment of all kinds and tools in that environment and in the context of joint activities. And we have evidence of this, for example, evidence of particular kinds of collective activities such as ritual, the growing the populations, the establishment of such populations in special locations in geography, the emergence of agriculture. So we can start thinking of how we can tell this detailed story about how special practices of claim making and linguistic in general emerge in the hominin lineage. All right, so I think that's enough to say there's no clear space here to say that there is a gap in this story between the basic and non-basic forms of cognition. Now, the question that remains is whether this then commits the view to the idea that all of the capacities have been completely transformed, and as such, there is no space for basic intentionality anymore. And I think this question is a fair question. I think the first thing to note is that it's true that cognitive capacities of the representational kind are not a further layer of complexity in a cognitive capacities cake. So it's not, we don't have a picture of the kind in which we have further layers of complexity one on top of the other. Rather, there is transformation. So these new capacities transform perception, action, memory, imagination, social action, and so on and so forth. But this doesn't imply that we need to endorse a strong transformative thesis. So the idea that all human capacities are wholly transformed, but rather a weak transformative thesis, which is the idea that even if this is the case, humans retain capacities for basic cognition. And how is this so? And I come to my last slide. We can think of this in terms of Wittgenstein's notions of a form of life. And the idea here is to think of humans and the human cognitive capacities as constituted by different yet connected activities, different activities, such as walking, talking, eating, but also diagnosing each other illnesses, communicating using symbols, maps, and so on, the examples in the Penn, Holojak, and Povinelli list. And we can think of these kinds as clusters of different traits that are grouped together in the same form of life. Yet, so in this way, not committed to the idea that this kind is unified by having a common cognitive feature, so that every cognitive activity has to be content manipulation or being informal representational capacities, and so on and so forth. And this also leaves room for important differences, setting apart each kind, and also within the kind between different activities and different forms of cognitions, without positing any unbridgeable gaps. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
That's wonderful, Glenda. Thank you very much for that. There's a fair bit to digest there. So we have at least one other live participant with us, and because I think it is always much healthier to have voices other than my own, I would like Manuel to unmute. Manuel, if you'd like to ask a question, just let us know. You can jump in. Have you any immediate questions, or I inevitably have a large number that I would love to get stuck into, but I'll, as I said, other voices than my own is a much healthier and more interesting way to go. So,
okay. First of all, thanks for the talk. That was wonderful. I just have two small questions. First of all, I would like to know if you have considered that the idea of contentfulness does not necessarily implies the idea of endorsing representationalism, in the sense that there are different authors that they are engaged into the expressivist tradition, and they claim that not all kinds of content are are based on representations, and these ideas of being wrong or right do not necessarily refer to the adequacy of a representation in your head to the world, but it can be these ideas of being wrong and being right, or the normative character of our thought, could be instead related to a kind of evaluation or assessment that we endorse when we judge certain action as normative or as rational. That would be my first question, if you open the door to this kind of view. And on the other side, you mentioned at the beginning of your talk that there are other kinds of intentionality, not only poor intentionality and the more refined one. So I would be really interested in knowing which are these other kinds of intentionality. So these are my two questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Manuel. So about the first question, I guess I will separate. Hello, I will separate different issues here. So one question is whether there are different kinds of content, and I find that problematic. I find that problematic because I think there's about content in the literature, and it's not very constrained. So people defend the idea, well, but they can be content can be something different. So people will define that in different ways depending on who we are discussing, and I guess it will require to discuss each proposal to give an answer to that. So that's one question, and I'm a bit skeptical about how can I say this? The idea that we are talking about the same thing having different forms, which is just the same claim that the uniformity thesis is wrong. But there are many things that people want to talk about when they talk about content. For example, if you want to talk about phenomenal experience, so there being a qualitative aspect to your experience, I'm fine with that. But I wouldn't define it as a kind of content, because a kind of content, then I will think it's something which is associated to a certain item and provides certain conditions of correctness for it, of some kind. It could be not through some falsity, but it's like some condition of adequacy. And I don't think that phenomenal experience works like that, right? So it depends a lot on what you are thinking when you are thinking of content, and this will require a very long discussion from us. But that's one point. Now, the other thing is, so there are ways in which I like the expressivist moves. For example, Baron is one, but I do think that there is sense to be made of this idea of expressing in behavior attitudes. I'm fine with that. I think that's very useful, but I wouldn't like to describe that as a kind of sort of more basic content that then it's the same but not yet the same as the sophisticated content that you get in language, and so on and so forth. And then we also talk about this distinction between different, that we do need some sort of normative account of more primitive forms of cognition that are not contentful in my sense, because you talk about right and wrong, these attitudes being adequate. I'm completely on board on that, but I don't want to describe it as different kinds of content, but rather different kinds of normativity. So I think there is a special kind of normativity, which is the normativity of truth and falsity, and that can be understood as a representational kind. Though there was a phrase at some point where you said in the head, representations in the head. I do not believe that representations are in the head in general. Not for the basic case, not for the complex case, never in the head, always in the environment, always in between people. So it's a special notion of representation as well. It's not just the same notion that the representational theory of mind uses. It's a very different one. It's a social account of content, social account of representation, and that again needs maybe more discussion. And about the second question, well, yes, that was intended to generate some curiosity. No, but I'm basically thinking that there's so much we need to say about social intentionality. And I think, well, a lot of social intentionality can be described just as war intentionality, but not all of it. And I think it becomes interesting to describe sophisticated forms of social interaction which are not driven by representations or not part of the game of claim making, but they are already, embedded in a very sophisticated social cultural environment. So I do want to have that word intentionality to describe special forms of social engagement. So that's what I'm thinking about. But I'm also thinking that we should remain open to the we don't know. We might need more. We don't know. So I think we shouldn't take this distinction between basic and contentful as one for all distinction that allows us to classify every form of cognition. Maybe we need more, and I think the spirit is a pluralistic spirit, and this is the common task of empirical work and theoretical work to find out what are the features of these different forms, and to what extent we can think of them as one or the other, or maybe something more. It would depend on how we classify discussion. But I think I mean, even if Rec makes this claim, and it looks like if this is an in principle distinction, and I don't think that. I think it's in part just based on observation of these different abilities.
So can I just jump in, because you'd made one particular comment there about truth and falsity that I really want to sort of follow up on, but it links very much with what you've just said there, in the sense that the uniqueness claim requires some kind of discontinuity, even though it doesn't necessarily imply an evolutionary discontinuity. But if there are other forms of cognition, might that discontinuity be just illusory, or it's and I think maybe part of the answer to that question is to the question that I wanted to follow up on that I mentioned, which is that you mentioned that truth and falsity is a special kind of normativity, and I was wondering if you could say what is special about it.
Okay. Let me. So I don't know that I fully grasp what you were thinking when you said that. Then the idea of discontinuity becomes illusory, because, I mean, in a way, it's like saying, maybe there is uniqueness all over. It's a claim for difference in that respect, right? Like, well, capacities, Chim's capacities for cognition are unique. Yes, I mean, I have no problem with that. So if that's what you mean by saying, well, in a way, you start to find these differences, and maybe the more we know, the more we can see the differences. Mm-hmm. and that's not impediment for telling a continuous evolutionary story. No, but it's not right. Mm-hmm. Perfect. Yeah, that's exactly what I think. But I think it's a mistake, which is not that it's driven by a theoretical assumption to think that we need to just find the same thing as unfolding into more complex, as if that were a requirement of the evolutionary continuity constraint. It's not, right? And so obviously there are other things we can worry about. So for example, we can think of to what extent perception in different animals is similar. And then there are further issues, right? So maybe there are traits or like properties of perception in other animals and us that are the same, and I don't want to deny that, right? Maybe basic cognition or forms of intentionality are continuous in a stronger sense than the psychological sense than other properties. But
so sorry,
right.
can I just, sorry to interrupt. So is the suggestion that all human beings perceive the same? Is that so? It would take, for example, given a cognitive function such as perception,
Yeah.
that human beings do it the same, but we do it differently to other animals. Is that the
right? Well, no, because so we have this distinction between basic intentionality and content-based, or the kind of the representational intentionality. So basic intentionality is very much a biological endowment in a way. So that doesn't mean that all humans perceive the same, but it does mean that being human it's essential for the way you perceive. In the case of basic perceptual capacities. Now, the idea is that capacities for representation or representational capacities, linguistic capacities, conceptual capacities do influence and transform perception to a certain extent. That's why I call it weak transformative diseases. And those might be culturally relative. So you have there you have to make a distinction between the fact that these capacities are culturally, conceptually influenced or permeated, and so the capacity that we have for that, which I think is it comes from evolution, and the special ways in which culturally we are influenced and we do perceive things. All of these can be and should be studied empirically, right? So yes, so I think the story in that sense is a bit complex, but it allows for a lot of difference between individuals and from species to species, and it depends on what So you might find a trait that springs from the lineage, right? That is not excluded. It's just that when you get the social cultural scaffolds, there is transformation, and that kind of transformation is something that it's only for not only for the humans, but also from the humans that are born in a particular history and a particular sociocultural history, right? So it's actually like indexed to our particular developmental phylogenetical history. And then, so that's about the first. Now the second was, what is special? Why is it, in what sense the normativity of truth and falsities it's special? And that's a very interesting question. I think so. I think I like this Penn, Holloyak, and Povinelli list because I think it relates with things like ability of humans to, for example, do science or have knowledge of the world in a way which is given by theories and things like this. And that I think is a particular capacity which is given by the social cultural history, by our linguistic abilities, but not only it's not just the language, it's a sort of normative practices and social practices into which we historically we are born in this history of practices of knowing the world, and I think that those have developed through history, right? So we have developed practices that allows us to describe things and take those things as measures for what we say in a way in which I would like to defend it's objective. So it's not just a matter of point of view. So we are getting at how things are and descriptions of this.
Okay.
Right?
That seems like a really important move just there.
Well, I mean, yeah. I mean, you can be. This is a different maybe philosophical discussion. So to what extent we have to be realists about how we think of truth. But suppose that we sort of are agnostic about that. At least we can say that we have this game of science in which we take each other to be talking about how things are. This can be our claim making game, right? Our claim making game is a game in which, I say something, you say something, and what makes that the case, we take it is something which is not your opinion or my opinion. It's how things stand with respect to what we are saying. This is the kind of game we're thinking about when we quote Hugh Price. Now, you're right that the discussion of whether this is form of realism, maybe it's just the way language works, that requires more argument. But at least we can say, well, there are games in which, we actually take things as being the criteria for what we are doing. And I think this is not necessarily the case in every form of cognition, right? So there are many ways in which we navigate and cognize the world which do not have this feature. And those are perfectly okay. Ways of responding, interacting, richly interacting with the world, with others, which are not like this. And so
are still normative?
Yes, I think they are. Okay. Yes. Yes, and right, they are normative. They are normative in the sense, for example, I can, if you think, a very simple example could be how is appropriate to, I don't know, dress in a particular situation. And this is something that it's just, how we take each other to be correctly dressed in a particular situation. And these are just responses to each other, right? There's that we are not trying to get at how it's right to dress or something which is an independent criteria. But it might also, so that's an example of the social life, in which the normativity of that is just how we take each other, treat each other as correctly dressed or appropriately dressed. But we can also think of examples in which, for example, of success, right? So like, a cat is mouse, and then it gets the mouse. That's good. It's correct in some sense. Misses a mouse. It's not correct. I don't know. So I think there are many different properties that are normative and they are relevant for cognition. So adaptation or success is one, and social adaptation to each other is different. And maybe there are many forms of social interaction that have different forms of normativity, so also combined with success, right? And all of this, I would think, it's not the same as getting at how things are.
Or, I mean, I guess there's a question of, but even within science, so, I mean, there's an important historical and evolutionary question here. If there is a game of, we call it the game of right and wrong, which is that there are statements that are true and statements that are false. We have to have some means of agreeing that something is true or something is false, or at least some means of assessing it. And that's always couched in measurement or observation or practices of consensus forming. I guess there a question in which those practices of consensus formation are any different to fashion and dressing right for, say, a formal or informal circumstance.
Well, yeah, no, well, I mean, many people would think not, but I think yes. I think in a way we are, we are. So how can I put this? I think you might think that these forms of normativity are embedded once in the others, right? So you cannot have, because of the way I think of, or the way many, within this field think about the role of social cultural practices, there's no way you can get to the claim-making objective norm without going through the social environment, without going to what you just described, without, it can't be independent of that. But I also think that there is that we make this difference, and the difference we make is it's a difference you can understand by thinking of the kind, again, of the kind of norm we take each other to be following. So we won't be comfortable saying, well, let's just change our view on whether that is white. Just do it like now. This is, I mean, we can do it, but it's not. It doesn't make sense, right? We can change our words for referring to it. We can change. So in the, but that doesn't mean that the way we get at how things are, or whether these things are white or not, it's independent of our practices of together discussing and getting at them. So I think especially a social game. But I also think that we do have these norms where we want to, trying to respond to what is out there by the means we have. And other practices are not like that. Other practices are about getting us to be better people, getting us to be better societies. And this is not necessarily, obviously, all of this requires more argument. But I think we can get at this intuitive difference. And interestingly, I do think that some of these distinctions play roles in thinking about contrast between other primates and humans. So I think there's a lot of social appropriateness in the social behavior of chimps and bonobos. Things they can not do if the alpha male is there, that you can do if. So it's a lot of social conformism and social practice, but not the kind of showing norm of truth that we have, among other things that might be different. But this is one.
Thanks.
So
that sort of helped me think about it a good bit. So Manuel, by the way, feel free to sort of jump in at any time if you want to, if you have anything else that you want to say or contribute. But so I'm have my eye on time a little bit at this point. I have a number of other questions. There's one I just want to ask quickly, but I don't want to dwell on it because it's it just has to do. I think it's just a matter of maybe the enactivists, of which I'm sort of the autopoetic enactivists rather than the radicalized group. Although I think we could probably consider ourselves fairly radical in a lot of ways. So I think there's less disagreement than your talk sort of initially suggested. So I think there would be sort of general consensus among enactivists that it is sense making all the way down as you had it. But I don't think that sense making all the way down necessarily implies a uniformity and a non-uniqueness. Insofar as when you have, when sense making is a necessarily contextualized phenomenon, and when sense making is contextualized and makes use of the resources that are only available within a human form of life, then essentially you have human uniqueness. I think one of the interesting differences there, of course, is that so you can have unique forms that are, that can still be described as sense making. And that you can show a continuity with basic survival coping, for example. But you can also see that distinction. So you can see a distinction between, say, human beings and non-human animals, but you can also see a difference in, and you touched on this later on in the talk when you talk about transformation, different kinds of sense making within a single human being, for example. That, the concept of sense making is a very broad church, and because it's always contextualized, it arises within a context of, in the case of human beings, practice and culture, for example. Then the specific processes of cognition are likely to be really quite varied, despite the fact that there is an underlying dynamic that is very similar, or can be shown to be continuous.
So so I think, in general, even for example, people like Tomasello or like Kim Sterny or Millikan, they all will say that there is human uniqueness. So it's not, but it's but the difference is in degree, not in kind.
Hmm.
So my question then back to you is whether you will say that autopoietic enactivism thinks that the difference between human cognition and other animals' cognition is a difference in degree or in kind.
I think now I can't speak for others on this front, and I'm highly aware that I haven't fully digested Hannah, Ezekiel, and Elena's recent book, Linguistic Bodies, on this one. But I think a lot of enactivists would be happy to say, yes, there is a uniqueness in kind to human cognition, precisely because there are uniquely human resources. And insofar as we might say it's all color, but humans have red, green, and blue available to them, and other animals have different colors, but it's all color.
Yeah, no, I think it's a tricky. So I think it's a tricky discussion because I don't think that so I don't think any form of autopoietic enactivism is in principle incompatible with rec. I actually do not think that. So I'm happy with the idea that we actually might be agreeing much more than is always made explicit or available, right? And I like that. I like agreement more than disagreement in theoretical discussions, because I think it allows us to construe more. But I think, I mean, my worry over the years has been that precisely that there wasn't enough attention on the specifically human ways of cognizing, which has been always my worry. And I do realize that now more people are targeting such specific forms, and I think linguistic bodies is an expression of that, which I'm very happy. And I haven't had the time to go through it, but I will certainly.
And Eric Riedfeld's work with his colleagues, Kiverstein and Brian Berg.
But I think I think it's still radical enactivists or rec or what I want to call it. And they stress this difference much more than, for example, Eric's and Julian's way of thinking of, actually make this point that they want to think of affordances in all levels as sort of very continuous. And I think we are more into the idea that language comes with and has developed along with forms of cognition, for example, arithmetical cognition and abstract thinking, which are very deeply transformative of our capacities. And in that respect, it's different from the kind of affordance you talk about when you talk about perception, or even in social settings. So I think there is a debate there about to what extent. So I don't think these are the same. So one worry I had with respect to the autopoietic view is that sometimes I feel like we need more nuanced distinctions in vocabulary to describe different forms of cognition. So, for example, I don't find it very useful, but at a very general level. But then I'm interested in thinking of things like, well, when we talk about intentions in joint action, for example, in the human case, in the human children's case. So what is the concept? And I think that concept is not the same concept that we should use theoretically to describe, I don't know, maybe cases of joint activity or social cooperation between chimps, right? So I'm interested in these nuances. But I think this is compatible with autopoietic enactivism because they can still include more and more distinctions. And maybe the new book is doing a lot of that, and that's great. Now, with Eric and Julian's view, I do like a lot, and I think a lot of what we are doing with our intentionality has to actually draw more on their work, and it's very congenial, and with ecological psychology in general, and this is brilliant. But we still want to stress this appeal to special forms of rational cognition, which still call for a stronger uniqueness claim. In that, I think we can show for example, by appealing to comparative psychology. So I'm interested in that. So seeing similarities, also differences, And speaking of these very high cognitive human capacities, in ways in which it's not the traditional way, but it's also not just in terms of affordances, which is what I have seen so far from American Union. But this, I think, it's an very interesting debate with them as well, because it's still close, but I think this is when the differences become useful and interesting, because we are working. The devil is always in the detail. So
That it is. So I'm eyeing up time. I think we should probably maybe call it to a close, but I want to give Manuel another opportunity to come in if there's anything else you want to add.
Yes, I have just another question, which is a question that I have asked Glenda before. But now that you mentioned the transformative character of language and how it can transform some other basic capacities, wouldn't that be the same, Rex approach to the natural origins of content, in which you have basic capacities, but then you engage into social interaction, and then you develop certain normative content, and these social abilities, in particular linguistic abilities, affect or transform our basic capacities. That looks pretty much to me like the idea of philosophers like McDowell, for example, in which McDowell claims that there's a first nature, which is it could be something like basic cognition, and then we engage into social interactions linguistically, and that is second nature, and that transforms or permeates our first nature. In that sense, that would be very similar, in the sense that you include the notion of content and the importance of language for transforming basic capacities.
right now, so this, in the longer version, the section of that part of the, which is the sila horn of the dilemma. And so McDowell, so we have the Chiarif, this part of the dilemma was the denying of the uniqueness, right? So the teleosemanticis, or the RTM or version of enactivism. On the other hand, you have the idea that these capacities are transformative to such an extent that there is really no sense in calling cognition anything other. And because of this, the intelligibility of the continuous evolutionary story is threatened, which is the Davidsonian argument.
But I would say, may I?
Yeah.
I would like to point out to a difference, which I think it is a substantial difference between Davidson and McDowell here. Because I think that McDowell, even when he strongly emphasized the importance of second nature that comes from language, unlike Davidson or even Charles Travis, for example, he claims that, for example, non-rational animals, as he calls them, they have a really rich perceptual and active life. They in that sense, he would not endorse this kind of approach like Davidson or Charles Travis, in which non-basic cognition is mere reaction to external stimuli. So there would be some kind, at least a very I don't know how to say this. It would be something much more complex than Davidson or Charles Travis in that sense.
Right. So the story with McDowell is that he has, over the years after Minor World, has sophisticated, because he has been so criticized about his view about, what is perception in animals. If it's not conceptually informed, then what is it? And so he has develop that, but I think they are very problematic ideas. So one idea, I don't like the idea of second nature and first nature. I think that's, I mean, as I said, I mean, I can send you, and I mean, there's this longer version where I just discuss that because I think it's important. But basically, the idea is just one unified nature, and I think this is a claim of relaxed naturalism as opposed to liberal naturalism, which is a kind that at least MacArthur and De Caro think that McDowell endorses, because McDowell thinks that there are these, so the first nature is the nature that you can describe through means by the hard sciences, and then you have the second nature, which in a way is not, it's not, there's no, you cannot address the second nature with the tools of the natural sciences. And I think this is a mistake. I think it's just one complex nature. I think, though it looks different, the basic intentionality and the contentful intentionality are interlinked, intertwined. This is not two stages, one nature, another nature on top. It's just it's so that's why I was trying at the very, 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 very end of my talk with maybe one slide address this. Speaking of form of life, in the sense, which is also a word of Julian and Eric, but in the idea that interrelated activities, and so it's so when you understand what human life, it's not that we have a biological nature, and on top of that layer of the cake you get the linguistic abilities, and then boom, you transform into a beautiful chocolate cake or something. But it's rather that it's all intertwined. You cannot, it's just, and I like this idea of there being different things, different abilities, different activities that are interrelated, and that so some of which can be described by means of biology, some of which need other tools, like maybe developmental psychology can address, and then so you use different sciences to address different aspects of a very complex form of life that integrates all of these aspects. So it's again, I want to say this is not the same picture as the McDowell picture.
Yeah. Okay.
But yeah, you need to see the details again and tell me what you think.
Okay.
So yeah, I'm going to have to unfortunately call a halt. I have a whole host of questions that I'd like to follow up with on individuality and sort of a couple of other issues, but I will have to take my own advice as I sort of offer to all and any who happen to be watching now or at some point in the future, that the discussion here can continue on the ENSO Seminars website, ensoseminars.com. You'll be able to find Glenda's talk there, and there for there'll be sort of a forum there to ask questions and to discuss or to continue the discussion asynchronically rather than either synchronous or diachronous. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much once again to Glenda Satne. It has been a lot of fun, and I'm very grateful for your talk. There was applause is kind of a strange thing in online seminars, but necessary, I think. We're grateful for finishing off the 2018 series, and we start again next month. The ENSO seminars will kick back off again in January, and announcements about that in due course. But in the meantime, we will say good night and or good evening.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.